Hi, English 2306 students. I'm your instructor, Dr. Murray. I wanted to make you a couple videos in which I talk a little bit about this class and some things to keep in mind about how to sort of approach some of the poems we're going to be looking at, or poetry in general. And then talk a little bit about the sonnet form, which is the first one we're going to look at. And then talk about a couple specific poems. So I'll just get started and start by saying, probably some of you have varying degrees of experience reading poetry, and so this is an introduction to poetry. Therefore, I'm not assuming right away that you've read a lot of poetry, and though maybe you have, I don't necessarily know what your experience is. But what I'll say is some of the poems we are going to look at are going to be older poems written hundreds of years ago. And so some of the language might be a little bit unfamiliar to you. And, instead of being just sort of intimidated or, frustrated or alienated by the poems because of the way the language differs from how we might instinctively express ourselves in our current time, I would recommend approaching these poems in a spirit of discovery and investigation and curiosity and hopefully appreciation. And it might be the case that what initially seems perplexing, with some examination, starts to make more sense. And, another thing that it's important to do is look words up that you don't know. And there might be cases where you want to look up a historical reference that you don't know. If we were using the Norton Anthology, oftentimes there are footnotes in there. Most of the poems we'll be looking at are from, the Poetry Foundation website or poets.org. So you might be lacking some of those footnotes, but I'm here to fill in some important blanks if you need them. And, we'll find our way through some of the difficulties that come along when you read. So I guess what I would say is one important thing is to pay very close attention to the poems, to not just think that you can read a poem once and get everything to be gotten from the poem. I will say that sometimes even on a first reading, you can have an experience with a poem. You can have your sort of initial gut feeling about the poem, or notice certain images or phrases that strike you, or hear the sounds of the poem and be affected by them. And that can be a very legitimate experience, even if you don't totally intellectually understand the poem on a first reading. What I would say is there are times where, it takes a while to develop a sort of deep intellectual understanding of a poem, and that's not the entirety of what the experience of a poem is. It would be like thinking that a film that you haven't written a paper about is a film that you have not sort of experienced. You can go to a movie and watch it and be interested, and there are even famous movies where their plot is notoriously complicated, or even in some cases doesn't quite make sense, and yet there are great pleasures that could be had from watching the movie, or or that there are some things about the movie that are so good that it transcends even a faulty or confusing plot. So I guess it's just a way, I'm trying to create an analogy by talking about movies there, but it's a way of saying you want to have an experience with the poem, and that involves paying close attention to it, reading it multiple times, looking up words you don't know, reading it aloud so you hear the sounds of the poem. But what I don't really want you to do is to just Google, so you can find the Wikipedia page that's just going to sum the poem up for you, as if reading a summary of the poem could substitute for the experience of sticking with the poem and reading it closely and hearing how it sounds. I mean, being told by someone else what the poem is about isn't the same as having an experience with the poem, which sometimes involves, first of all, sometimes it can involve frustration, and that can be part of the process. But movies frustrate us too, in that they just when you think you're going to get to a satisfying resolution, the movie will take a certain turn that delays that satisfaction. And as much as that might be frustrating, it can ultimately be part of what the ultimate pleasure of the movie is. It was more interesting because that payoff was withheld until later or something like that. And so I guess it's a way of encouraging you not to just immediately Google and go to Wikipedia or some other website to try to find out what the sort of poem means. That's not in the spirit of what we're trying to do here. So I discourage you from doing that, and I want you to sort of trust yourself to try to figure out a little bit what the poem means, and know that that's harder or takes more work, but it's also what's going to develop you into a much better or more sophisticated or more adept reader of poetry. I would also say, if you form initial impressions of what a poem is about, it's good to note those or maybe write them down, but I also would not get overly attached to an impression that maybe upon greater sort of analysis doesn't ultimately pan out. Like, there are times where people will read a line of a poem and go, oh, that makes me think of this, therefore this is what this poem is about. But then the next question might be, well, what else in the poem would support that reading? And if there ends up not really being very much or nothing else at all that supports that reading, maybe even though you thought of that reading, upon closer examination, maybe that's not a terribly accurate reading of what the poem is about. And so when I talk about an accurate reading of what the poem is about, in a way that connects to the idea that the claims that you're making, if you're writing about it, can be supported with evidence from the poem. And so that leads to the last kind of general comment I want to make, which is that one poem can mean different things to different people. And in fact, one poem can mean different things to one person at different times. Two people could look at the same poem now and see it slightly differently, or maybe more than slightly. And it's possible that both of those interpretations could have validity to them if the reading can be supported with evidence from the poem. Why is that? It's partly because people bring different life experience or different understanding to the poem. It's also the case that one person could look at a poem and then see it a certain way or come up with a certain interpretation of the poem, and then read it again 10 years later and they see the poem quite differently. That certainly can happen and does happen, and it certainly happened to me. However, because that's true, sometimes people will come to the conclusion that a poem can mean whatever you want it to mean, and that I do not agree with at all. When Shakespeare writes some of his sonnets, most of them are about love in some way. And if you were to say, well, this is about, the war on terrorism or something. It would be like, okay, how'd you get there? What's your support for that interpretation? And if there really isn't that much that is convincing support for that interpretation, you might have to let go and say, well, maybe that's not what it's about. So it's a way of saying a poem can't just mean whatever you want it to mean, but, you know, we're not all going to see a given poem the exact same way. And so that's part of why it can be interesting and fruitful to talk about poems with other people and see what they see that you don't see, and vice versa. Okay, so now I want to transition into talking a little about the sonnet form. So the sonnet is this form that started in Italy in the, I think, 1400s. And, sonnet comes from the Italian word sonetto, which means little song. And Petrarch, who's one of the great sort of masters of the Italian sonnet of the sort of Renaissance era, is someone who we're going to look at. We're also going to look at Sir Thomas Wyatt, a British poet who is the one who essentially imported the sonnet into the English language. And part of how that came about was that he was part of the court and he was a diplomat for King Henry VIII, and travel was part of his diplomatic duties. And in traveling to Italy, he encountered these Italian sonnets, Petrarch sonnets, and fell in love with them, but also thought, well, I want to translate these into English. And what was involved in that process also was that he was a very different kind of person and very different kind of poet than Petrarch. And so in the process, while some of his poems you could say are translations, others are a little looser as far as the translation, and they're more like he's rewriting, almost like a band covering another band's song. There's some bands that will cover a song by a previous band and it sounds just like the original, and there's some where they change it and make it their own so much that it hardly sounds anything like the original. And so I think Thomas Wyatt did a little bit of both of those in adapting or translating Petrarch. So the sonnet form, some other important things to tell you about it. I mean, I want you to read my sort of overview of the sonnet that I mentioned on the course schedule. But, it's a 14-line poem, and the Petrarchan or Italian sonnet has a different rhyme scheme and structure in a way than the English sonnet, or what eventually became the Shakespearean sonnet. Now, Shakespeare came after Sir Thomas Wyatt, so when Wyatt started writing his English sonnets, they weren't quite yet the Shakespearean, because it was going to take Shakespeare to do that, but they were different than the Petrarchan. So you can see that the form begins to change, and then it really changes as we reach the 20th century. So let me start talking about Petrarch's Sonnet 190. So I would like you to look along with me at the poem. So if you need to pause this and bring up a computer screen where you can look at Petrarch's Sonnet 190, it should be in Canvas on the home page. And I will just say we can see that it's 14 lines. We have 2 stanzas of 4 lines each, and then we have 2 more stanzas of 3 lines each. So 8 and 6 is 14, and 8 lines, the 2 4-line stanzas, make up what's called the octave, and then the 2 3-line stanzas add up to 6. They make up the sextet, and this is how the Italian sonnet was structured. Okay, I'm going to end this video here and start a new one.